We'll wait just a second or so, but the sound should be on right about now. So welcome to Friday, guys. You've taken the quiz on prokaryotes and viruses. You handed in the constant questions. This is today's video lecture on fungi or fungi, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and protists. And obviously the link will be sent later because I'm making the link right now. Truth be told, guys, I mean, you can view the video today on Friday if you want, or if you want to view it in a couple little parts, whatever, and spread it out, or as long as you watch it at some point before we get into our meeting on Monday, that's fine. And then don't forget, if you are choosing to do the optional chapter 16 guided reading, that is due on Monday. Okay. All right, so that's sort of where we're at. Let's go ahead and pull open the presentation. So we're talking protists and fungi today. One of the biggest things as we kind of move into this grouping, if you will, is that now we are moving into eukaryotic cells, right? So these are cells that are that have a nucleus. Okay, we're sort of upping our way into the complexity a little bit. Not that there wasn't a certain level of complexity to that of the prokaryotes, but we're going to start to see not only a nucleus, but also certain examples of multicellularity. Okay? In general, very diverse group of organisms. Structure-wise, they can be unicellular, meaning single-celled. They can be multicellular, meaning lots of cells. There are also examples that are of ones that are colonial, which means there are groups of cells that are separate cells nonetheless, but they work together, almost like in clumpings, but they're not truly multicellular. And then they do, of course, have a nucleus with organelles like we just talked about, so they're eukaryotic. Okay. And then nutrition-wise, they can be autotrophic, so make their own food. They can be heterotrophic. They seek out and find and feed on other things for food. And then some can even be parasitic. Remember, parasites are those things, or parasitic items or organisms are those that would feed on a living host. And then in the case of parasitism, it has a detriment to the host, right? It can be harmful to the host. So just to kind of give you guys a bit of a visual, sort of some of the three dividing lines here, we have sort of slime molds, which we're going to talk about. We have, so slime molds over here, we have the algae over here, which act kind of like plants, which include things like diatoms and algae, right? And then in the middle here, we have what are called the protozoans. So the protists are this sort of large umbrella term. And then there are kind of three subgroupings within the protists. We have the slime molds, we have the algae, and then we have the protozoans. And the protozoans are things like amoeba, euglena, dinoflagella, paramecium, these things listed in the middle. And the protozoans sort of act like animals, okay, or sort of similar to animals. So I'm sorry, not animals. This is plants over here, right? Duh, Mr. P. So the algae act like plants, okay, and these protozoans act like animals, right, in a sense. So what do I mean by that? Autotrophic, okay, typically heterotrophic over here, right? Okay, all right. So one of the ways that protists are categorized is according to their motility, and this is a word we've heard before. It's basically how they move, right? Okay. So there's basically four ways that we look at motility within this group. Flagellated movement, okay, so one long whip-like appendage. Pseudopodial movement, where there's this like extension and finger-like projections of the cytoplasm on the plasma membrane, and it sort of almost moves like a blob forward, okay? And there's ciliated movement, where we have lots of hair-like projections, shorter than flagella, but these hair-like projections work together on the outside of the cell. And then there's immotility. And what is immotility? Basically, immotility means that it doesn't move. It doesn't move. It stays stationary, okay? All right, so flagellated movement, pseudoproteal movement, ciliated movement, and then immotility, where in this case it has a lot of these will have these types of cells have what's called an apical complex, which will literally mean that it has sort of like almost like this like think of apical comes from the word apex. An apex of a triangle would be like the point of a triangle. An apical complex is almost like this spike or the apex of a triangle in a sense that allows the cell to penetrate and dig into the surface of a host cell. So here's paramecium is an example. It has ciliated movement. It's got those hair-like projections all over the surface of its body, acting like almost like a series of a bunch of little tiny oars. Euglena is an example that has flagellated movement, so a single flagella. Euglena is kind of a funky one that we're going to find out about later on. And it's actually kind of funky. Like Euglena is part of this group of the protozoans. Okay, it acts like an animal, but it actually contains chloroplasts too, and it can photosynthesize. So it's kind of like a little bit like an algae and acting like a plant in a sense, okay, but it is also acting like an animal. So there's some kind of little bit of alien-like features a little bit within this particular group of organisms. And then in the middle here, the one kind of type of movement that is probably maybe a little bit most unique is that of pseudopodial movement of things like the amoeba. You get these sort of finger-like projections of the cell membrane sort of reaching out, and then we see cytoplasmic streaming pushing up into those finger-like projections, and it works forward almost like this sort of like blob from one side to the other. Now, I'm going to have to do a little bit of flipping back and forth because I'm working from one file type to another file type. And my hope is that you guys can see this okay on the small screen. But I also know that like this PowerPoint presentation, you guys have been emailed and it has the exact same video clips in it. Don't mind Brecken going back and forth back there. She's grabbing some stuff to play with. All right. So this gives you an image of pseudopodial movement with amoeba. You see those, these pseudopods. And pseudopod means like basically like fake finger, almost like, or fake extensions. Pseudo meaning fake. Okay. But you see them sort of reaching forward, and then you see that cytoplasm pushing forward, and slowly it kind of works its way across the screen. Right? So pretty cool. Okay. Ooh, nice. All right. Cool, Brecken. All right. So we'll go back to this other screen. All right. So another way, and again, now we're working into the different kind of classifications. Again, remember we have slime molds, the protozoans, and then the algae. Right? So starting with, and probably most typically when people think of the protists, we think of the protozoans. These are those things like that of amoeba, euglena, paramecium, that a lot of these are, like we did the pond water lab, we saw a lot of examples of paramecium and euglena. We saw some of these amoeba. These are typically kind of these pond water organisms that are kind of standard examples that are used to kind of show some of the diversity within the protozoans as part of the larger collective of the protists. Okay. Again, like we said, protozoans act like animals. That means they're heterotrophic. They will eat eat bacteria or other protists. So they'll eat prokaryotes or bacteria, or they will actively seek out and consume other protists. Aquatic environments, but also aquatic environments includes water in the soil. Little bit more typically leaning towards the unicellular as opposed to colonial, but not multicellular. And most will reproduce asexually, right? So forming genetically identical. So they reproduce through mitosis, right? Asexual reproduction. So just kind of a few examples, and you'll also notice like some of these that I want to kind of point out. So like a lot of these different protozoans will have some different sort of devastating or cause some sicknesses. So the trichinosis is a type of protozoan that can cause illness. Trypanosoma right here causes African sleeping sickness. Malaria causing Plasmodium. Entamoeba histolytica causes amoebic dysentery. Dysentery is basically diarrhea. So some of these, a lot of these protozoans can cause certain illnesses. Not all of them, don't get me wrong, but some of them will cause certain illnesses. And now moving onward into slime molds, okay? A lot of them will, slime molds, I should say this, slime molds typically they act like, think of them as acting like fungus. We're gonna get into talking about fungus later on. They are heterotrophic, they break down and decaying organic material. Common anywhere there is moist decaying material, whether it's plant or animal materials, but they are larger than protozoans. They are still unicellular, but kind of the separating feature here with the slime molds, obviously heterotrophic, they break down dead and decaying organic material, and they reproduce sexually though by forming spores through meiosis. So that's kind of the big kind of separating feature as you look at the sort of the place that slime molds fit into as compared to the protozoans that we just got done talking about. So slime molds are some kind of funky things. You know, if you've ever seen like kind of this, you know, this sort of yellow slimy material on sort of a dead or decaying surface. So here's a picture of some slime mold on a decaying log. What you're seeing is slime mold, and it's a protozoan. A lot of people think it's a fungus, but it's not. It's actually not a protozoan. It's a protist. Sorry, I misspoke. Okay. This is also, so we're gonna take a look at a video of slime mold growth. Through rapid growth, this material can grow incredibly quickly. Again, I got to click over to my other file for us to be able to see this. Okay. So again, hopefully you guys can see this okay. Again, the same video though is in the PowerPoint that I've sent you. Now again, this is time-lapse photography, so this is, you know, I'm not totally sure exactly how long this is, but you still get a feel for how quickly this material grows, what it looks like. It literally looks like this sort of slimy, globby mess of material. It's pretty cool. All right, so back to this other slide. And then finally, algae. So these are the ones that we said act like plants. They're autotrophic. They use chloroplast and execute photosynthesis. Live in aquatic environments, both freshwater and saltwater. Unicellular, colonial, multicellular. We are now starting to see, and I want to kind of say this out loud, we see a little bit more examples of multicellularity within this particular subgroup of the protists, and can produce sexually or asexually, right? Quite a wide range of kind of looks that we see within the algae. And we see also diatoms included within this. So you see they will form their own kind of calcite or calcium carbonate shells in a sense. So a lot of kind of different crazy looks that we see in terms of the actual structure of these organisms. And then one in particular is that of Volvox, which is kind of cool. Volvox is and again, alluding towards this idea of multicellularity. we're going to kind of get into more examples of multicellularity. This is sort of one of those sort of steps that bridges that gap. And Volvox is an example of this. It is not truly a multicellular organism, but it's actually colonial. It's a small clump of cells, sort of spherical in shape, and each one of these cells sort of has their own flagella connected to it. Let me go to the other screen here, and should be able to see this sort of movement. So you can see Volvox moving all these cells sort of work in conjunction together to be able to propel and move this entire sort of clump. Interesting thing about like this kind of clump of cells, that it is, it's photosynthesis. It's photosensitive. It'll react to light, and it'll react to changes in chemical levels or temperature. So again, it's sort of that first situation where we start to see multicellularity, and not truly it's colonialism, right? But multicellularity, it's alluding towards that, cells working together, right? Up until this point, everything that we've really talked about within this sort of area has been, essentially looking at from the unicellular perspective. Okay. Excuse me. All right. So protists and evolution. Protists evolved from prokaryotes. So prokaryotic cells that we just got done kind of talking about within our last unit. All right. So protists evolved from prokaryotes. Fungi, plants, and animals all evolved from protists. So again, kind of the step process here. So we have prokaryotes. We have the protists sort of in the middle here. Okay. And then we have fungi, plants, and animals that we're going to talk about. So fungi, plants, and animals. This is sort of the bridge between it. Did you need something? No. So there's sort of two processes that led to protist evolution, and kind of how do we jump from prokaryotic cells to eukaryotic cells? Well, there's kind of two parts to this. There's the infolding of cellular membranes to ultimately evolve into the cytomembrane system, which includes really the nuclear membrane, rough and smooth ER, and all that good stuff of the cytomembrane system that we learned about in a previous unit. And then also endosymbiosis. So we talked about endosymbiotic theory, the fact that mitochondria and chloroplasts used to be free living organisms, right? That were engulfed by other prokaryotes, and then ended up developing a symbiotic relationship. So these kind of two pieces to the puzzle bridge the gap from the prokaryotes, right, to the protists, and then the protists to ultimately fungus, plants, and animals, right? So this is just kind of a visual of what they're talking about. So here's protist evolution. So you see the infolding of that plasma membrane, ends up developing into things like the nucleus and ER. And we also see kind of along the way here that these cells came into contact with other free living photosynthetic prokaryotes, or aerobic prokaryotes that eventually became, in this case, mitochondria, in this case, chloroplasts. Okay. So this is a real key step in terms of kind of bridging the gap from really prokaryote to eukaryote, and then ultimately from eukaryote to sort of single-celled and simplistic, ultimately to making steps towards multicellularity and quite complex. So this is a real key kind of step in that process, obviously, right? Now, Next, we're going to move into fungus, or fungi, or fungi, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Either way, this is now we're moving into full multicellularity. The thing about fungus is there's some kind of interesting features to it that I think that you guys will sort of see and understand. A lot of times people kind of make this mistake and think that fungus is kind of a type of a plant. It is not. It is, is separate from the plant kingdom. It's not. They are not plants. They are their own sort of separate group of organisms. Now, what makes them unique? Their bodies are made of these things called hyphae, which are basically sort of threads of cytoplasm surrounded by cell membrane and cell wall that are interconnected, okay, by these large pores. By the way, the cell wall is made of chitin, okay? So this is a unique difference, that chitin is a protein. The cell walls that we've seen up to this point were made out of typically sort of combinations of proteins and peptidoglycan, carbohydrate. Chitin is exclusively a protein, type of protein. Chitin's the kind of the protein that's in your hair and fingernails. It's also in the exoskeletons of insects. So it is a common sort of structural protein that's used within different organisms. And this is the same with that as fungus, right? It gives structural support to the cell. Anyway, the thing that makes, I think, that's probably the most unique thing about it is the fact that in a lot of ways, fungus, you got to think of it as almost this incredible sort of web or matrix of interconnectedness. The cytoplasm, you have cytoplasm that's typically kind of stuck to one cell within, maybe even a multicellular organisms, or even the protists that we just got done looking at. However, in the case of the fungus, it's more or less continuous, right? These hyphae, I think of them as almost like this branched system that moves throughout the body and entire structure. In fact, many of these hyphae sort of branching together creates different structures, and one of those first structures is this thing called the mycelium. The mycelium is the feeding structure. It's not roots, but it's sort of, I don't know, it's not sort of somewhat analogous to roots, but it's not necessarily truly roots. But the mycelium is kind of that sort of root-like structure. So here's a typical, kind of look of a mushroom, right? We have the mycelium, which is the material that's sort of below ground. It secretes digestive enzymes. It breaks down dead decaying organic material. And then the top of the mushroom, okay, or the fungus, is what's it's called the ascus, that is the reproductive structure, okay? So we also start to see, this is also kind of interesting as you move into this group, a little higher level of complexity. We now see a differentiation of parts of their bodies or structures. We have kind of a feeding structure, right? And then we have a spore-producing structure that is responsible for reproduction, okay? So this is now, we're moving into kind of higher orders of complexity. Fungus are heterotrophic, and most are decomposers. There are some that are parasitic, but most of them would be responsible for breaking down dead or decaying organic material. They obtain food by what's called absorptive nutrition, right? So it's a fancy word for this, this mycelium structure secretes these digestive enzymes that allows it to break down and ultimately absorb these macromolecules that are present upon which they're often decaying and breaking down. Think of it kind of in a way as, this is almost like if you looked at it as an analogy, it's almost like it's our stomach almost like turned inside out in a sense. They've got this sort of material that secretes these digestive enzymes that break down the dead or decaying organic material that they lay upon or sit upon. All right, so then from the reproduction perspective, this is also, we see a big switch here in terms of the way that these organisms reproduce. They can form through sexual or asexual pathways. So we see sort of multiple ways in which they reproduce, and it can change depending on environmental conditions. That's an advantage. This is something that we see in plants. Okay. We also see the fact that they will create large numbers of spores, and these spores ultimately can be carried by wind and water to great distances. And also the fact that these spores are protective, can withstand, they're durable, they can withstand pretty harsh conditions. They are released by the hyphae, so the reproductive structure, the spore producing structure, and they can, sorry, I missed my screen. They can, move to different areas and are quite durable. They found different spores from, archaeological digs from, or different spores they've discovered that are, tens of thousands of years old, and they've, been buried underground for incredible amounts of time, and they're able to actually germinate them and grow into new fungus. Okay. All right, so a couple little things, so this is a cool sort of video, this thing called the Earth Star fungus. It's a type of fungus that it'll give you a feel for its growth within just a 20-minute time span. This is still time-lapse photography, but it's pretty cool. I'll let it go. So just in 20 minutes, this fungus will sort of open up and show that much movement. We don't always get a sense of kind of the movement of some of these things, or some of these different living organisms in terms of how they change or move through time. Okay. So this is kind of a funky looking one type of fungus. And then the next, again, and I think we've all maybe seen these sort of puffball mushrooms, right? That they produce tons and tons of spores, right? So each one of those little sort of fragments, whatever you want to call it, these that are coming off of these puffball mushrooms, are the potential for a new fungus, and you can see them being carried away by by the air, right? And the potential for a new fungus. And the advantageous piece to that I want you guys to sort of understand is that it is another way to guarantee reproduction, right? To reproduce in large amounts. Insects do this, plants do this, fungus does this. They will typically reproduce in really large amounts. What's the guarantee from an evolutionary perspective is that at least some of them will survive. Okay. All right. So diversity-wise, there are just kind of 4 different types of fungus. There's sac fungi, club fungi, yeasts, and molds. Sac fungi can be terrestrial, aquatic. Many are parasitic. They have this sort of the sac structure called an ascus. This is the typical mushroom that you think of, right? So like here, right? You've got the sort of the mushroom stem, and then we've got the top of the mushroom, right? That is the typical sac fungus. Okay. Club fungus are those that have a club sort of shape and spore producing structure, typically act as decomposers of plant material, but they don't have, they look a little different. So these would be examples of club fungus right here. These are called morel mushrooms. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of these before, but morel mushrooms are a really sought after type of fungus. They're actually really quite expensive. They only grow in the wild. And then different chefs and things like that, and restaurants really will seek out these types of mushrooms. People go out and sort of search for morels and will sell them because they are quite expensive, actually, because they're very rare. Okay, but you notice kind of the difference, right? The club fungus, there's sort of, it's not like an umbrella in a sense over here of that a sac fungus. It's almost like the spore producing material is exposed and opened. Okay. And then yeasts, single-celled, they need liquid and a moist habitat. Yeast are a type of fungus, and then finally molds. Molds are, so yeasts are microscopic organisms, single-celled, and then molds are kind of they will grow on, rapidly on a surface, right? It's any fungus that grows rapidly on a surface. So molds is that kind of, I don't know, fuzzy, dry-looking green material that grows on the surface of maybe different rotting materials. Not to be confused with slime molds, right? Slime molds are different, right? These are a fungus. So slime molds from earlier discussion, they look slimy, they look wet. In the case of molds in this respect, they look sort of dry and sometimes sort of fuzzy or chalky, or however you want to kind of describe it. Okay. All right. Fungus in a lot of ways, in not every fungus, but obviously in many ways, fungus play a role in various diseases. 30% of all fungus are actually parasitic and can be quite harmful, right? So some examples in plants: Dutch elm disease. I don't know, maybe you've heard of this before, but Dutch elm disease is a plant fungus that in the upper Midwest has, in the last sort of 25 to 40 years or so, has really decimated elm trees. It used to be out there, elm trees were quite prevalent, but this particular fungus has decimated elm trees. So Dutch elm disease, this fungus kills the trees, and there are elm trees are become somewhat rare within the upper Midwest. Examples in animals: pulmonary yeast infections, so various yeast infections. Our yeast is a type of fungus. Ringworm, right, is a type of fungus. It's not a worm, that's sort of a misnomer, but ringworm here, right? So that's sort of circular, it's a fungal infection. You treat it with a antifungal cream, right? The other one over here, this one's kind of interesting. It's called thrush, okay? But it's a fungus that will grow on like the tongue or the back of the tongue. And it's really only seen like adolescents and adults won't ever get thrush. It's only little kids that will end up with thrush. But it's this sort of gross, sort of cakey buildup of fungus that lives on the surface and the back of the surface of the tongue. A lot of times, like thrush actually can come from like things like it's a parasitic fungus that exists in things like products that contain honey or untreated or raw honey that can cause this. Okay. And then last, just to kind of put some perspective on this, fungus and where they play or what role they play in the biosphere. So from a level of, what connections do they have to other things? So fungus can have a symbiotic relationship with two other types of organisms. Lichen. So lichen is that kind of dry green leafy stuff that you might see like on dead trees or the sides of barks of tree, or even on like bare rock surfaces. It is a symbiotic relationship between fungus and algae, right? The fungus helps to digest and break down different materials. The algae is photosynthetic and provides food for the fungus, right? So they play a symbiotic role. A little bit more, I think, major is to talk about fungus and plants and this stuff called mycorrhizae. A lot of plants have developed symbiotic relationships with fungus. Mycorrhizae are basically a fungus that lives or connects itself into the root system of various plants. Various, like corn is an example of a type of organism that will use mycorrhizae. This mycorrhizae, basically, it increases the active root structure for the nutrient for water acquisition, nutrient acquisition. So if the plant went on without no sort of symbiotic relationship with any sort of fungus, it could still absorb water, but not as well. So these fungus, they attach to and create this sort of extension or web of the root system. And what does that do? It helps them to obtain nutrients in their relationship to these photosynthetic plants, but vice versa, then they also provide water and nutrients to the plants themselves. So they both have a benefit. Okay. Obviously, chemical cycling, primary decomposers. So fungus are great decomposers. Their job in our ecosystem or in our biosphere is to help along with bacteria to break down dead and decaying material, to return it back to these different chemical cycles that we learned about earlier this year. And then finally, kind of commercial uses. I know some people don't really like mushrooms. Some people do. But some mushrooms are edible, and there is a commercial use for it in cooking and things like that. Fungus are used in wine and beer production. Funguses are used in the ripening and creating and making of cheeses. So again, quite a sort of large diversity of uses that we apply and use for these fungus. But again, I think I want to kind of return to this. This is probably, if you want to kind of really break down to what's kind of the biggest piece to the kind of the role that they play, is the fact that they are decomposers. Okay. All right. Well, that wraps it up today, guys. Like I said, you guys on Monday, make sure that if you are deciding to turn in that optional chapter 16 guided reading, that you do so. All right. That is it. We will see you guys later.